get started. All right, who's ready to get started? Let's hear it. Good morning, everybody. You made it. So I want to thank you guys all for braving New York City to come into what has become the most incredible conference and the first ever here for the 8P community. And you guys are all here. You give yourselves a round of applause. My name is Carrie. Even though I'm not part of the 8P community, I am part of the rare disease community. I am a rare parent. My youngest daughter was diagnosed with an ultra-rare genetic disorder. So even though it may be a little bit different than 8P, I definitely understand the challenges having a medically complex child has. And I'm hoping, let me, show of hands, how many of you have never met an 8P family in person before? Okay, let's do this the other way. How many of you have? That's actually pretty impressive. So for all of you who raised their hands the first time, when you walk away tomorrow night, you're gonna walk away with a brand new extended family. This is something that you won't realize how exciting and how meaningful this will be until you guys walk out the door with your new extended connections. So again, thank you guys for coming out. Just a few reminders before I introduce Bina. You will notice that some of you have color codes, color circles on your name badges. This is for our breakouts this afternoon. And it was lower level 1, the lower level 1, right? I keep getting confused between children. So for the breakouts at 2:15, for those of you with the colored badges, you're gonna go down to lower level 2, and your rooms are in the agenda. We ask that those of you who don't have color tags, please do not come to this because we are max beyond capacity for those rooms. So if you have a color-coded badge, please enjoy yourself. What you're going to do is you're going to be meeting with some specialists who you're going to have an opportunity to answer any question that's been on your mind and listen to some of the stories and share some of the concerns the other families in your group have. Now, in addition, we've had some requests to videotape these breakouts. We cannot have anybody videotape the breakouts. The reason is because we're encouraging all of you to share your personal stories, your personal experiences, and we don't want that being shared outside. So if you had wanted to videotape the breakouts, you're welcome to videotape this, even though we're going to be having it professionally videotaped. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice this morning. We ask that you do not videotape the breakouts. So is everybody cool with that? Right? Give me a thumbs up if you're cool with no videotaping. Fantastic. All right, a few other things. Most of you have t-shirts, and for those of you, we ran out of sizes. I am so sorry, but we are encouraging everybody who does have a t-shirt, and for those of you who don't, wear something fun and colorful, because we're gonna be taking our first ever big group 8P photo tomorrow at 11:30? 11:30 down in the front and the outside. We're gonna have guides for you tomorrow, but please wear your t-shirts if you have it. If you don't, wear something fun and colorful, because this is making magic, right? This is good. Yeah, the main lobby entrance. Okay, so you guys ready to get started? So I want to introduce someone who really needs no introduction, and I just want to say I have worked with over 300 or 400 parent advocates like Bina. She's going to start blushing. The amount of work, she has literally spent hundreds of hours putting this together. So I wanted everyone to give her a round of applause as a thank you, because this is her baby. We're just here to help her out. So she is the reason that the 8P community has hope. And with you guys here today, you're the next generation that is going to help her continue to create even more hope. So, Bina.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Project 8P conference. I'm in awe, and I truly am. I truly cannot believe that we have all come together. There are 63 families here in a race to unite in New York City in just under 6 months. 6 months, that is truly unbelievable. I mean, rare disease organizations, it doesn't matter, just to even find each other. I am so impressed with all of the effort and energy each of you have put to be here today. Why are we here? I think we're all here for a very simple mission. It's to improve the lives of our 8P heroes. It's to improve our lives as caregivers and everyone that's involved in this 8P community. And personally, I am here to find treatment for chromosome 8P. We are here as a family to find treatment to help the undiagnosed, the unborn, those that are the next generation to come. Personally, our family has made this commitment. Thank you all for making such a huge commitment to be here. Just want you to know that Project 8P is not Bina's foundation. It is actually a public charity. It is your foundation. It is our Project 8P. So I want you guys to know that. You're here today because we are all going to do this together. How many of you feel alone? Or you felt alone? In 2012, I was alone remarkably in the 21st century of modern medicine, alone and helpless. Karina got a diagnosis, and I didn't know anyone else that existed with the same diagnosis. And in the last 18 months, we have 200 patients that have contacted us and just expressed interest in our research study. So thank you all so much. And I really do feel like that deserves a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you for having the faith in our research study and the purpose of it. And I promise you today and in the future that I will not let you down, that we are going to achieve this mission. Just when we were building momentum, exactly 6 months ago, 6 months ago I was alone again. My mother, Pratima Manyar, would be sitting here as our biggest fan, and I lost her suddenly and out of nowhere. She was Karina's biggest fan. They had a unique bond. They could feel each other's hearts. They communicated with their eyes. And only 3 months after that, this past April, I lost my grandmother unexpectedly. And I didn't want life to give me this perspective, but it did. I'm telling you this so that you know that my mom's strong spirit pushed me forward to build the framework for what is now Project 8P. And her wishes are so appreciated. With my parents' contribution, my dad, Cash, who is here today, my parents who generously contributed $10,000 today to make sure we continue to drive change for the 8P community. So I'm very grateful for that. I miss my mother and my grandmother dearly. But I also wanted to tell you that the light my parents show me at the end of this tunnel, or what I thought was the end of the tunnel, are the courage and resilience that I gained every time each of you asked me a question on Facebook, or said a really kind thank you on email, or Facebook Messenger, or text message. Every time, every day, I looked forward to it. And you didn't know what I was going through. And that's when all of my 8P strangers became real friends. So thank you for giving me something to look forward to. Somehow studying scientific questions, what I have no science background whatsoever, brought me a lot of joy on those sleepless nights. And those very same Facebook questions made me realize that this cannot wait any longer. There are too many unknowns. Every day that goes by is precious, and we actually have to work hard alongside the researchers. We have to be their partners. It's not about us just asking them questions, and we have to ask them really difficult questions, by the way, today. But it's about us being their partners, us sharing everything that we know about 8P with them, and helping identify the patterns, find the clues, and being their partners along the journey. In those same 6 months that tragedy affected my family, all of you saved money and made time out of your busy lives to be here in New York City so we can sweat together in 90 degrees and figure out how to give them the best opportunity at life. Finally today, we have real people and not just behind social media posts. We have people you can hug. We have people you can look in their eyes and you know that they're going through the same thing. When I hear your journey and all of your bumps along the road, your ups and downs, I get some glimmer of info into my future for my daughter. Because after all, we are here to toss that old literature aside that told us what these AP heroes cannot do, prove them wrong, and solve everything that they can do. Six years ago, when Karina was born, something didn't feel right. The doctors I saw back then thought I was overthinking it. They didn't or they couldn't help. I found my way to a diagnosis eventually with relentless fatigue. Karina is so cute. It's easy to get lost in her adorable trance. She hugs and she kisses. She's an easy baby. That's what everybody told me. She's so easy. Easy. Did that mean she didn't know how to cry? She didn't know how to kick? She didn't know how to be naughty? She could barely move due to her low muscle tone and poor motor control. I didn't want to have an easy baby. I wanted to have a toddler who got into trouble, run around in the playgrounds. I wanted a toddler who was babbling and making a lot of noise and building block towers. Easy was far from it. But I did what I had to do. We did what we had to do. We're still doing what we have to do. I had no control and I was confused. None of it is easy. When will she improve and get better? Will she still do this when I'm no longer around? Will she be able to live on her own? Who can help us find the answers? Do I even know what questions I should be asking? Am I asking the right ones? Who in this world is working towards treatment for AP heroes? What I did read about on AP mentioned poor cognition, seizures, autism, just to name a few. I realized I had even more questions. There were no experts on this disorder. Trust me, I contacted every single author and corresponding author on any article that mentioned AP over the last 25 plus years. Only 2 authors responded. One told me that they were retired. And there we were. So a few years went by and I focused on Karina's health and her growth, which is still a puzzling enigma. And all of her intensive therapy and her specialist appointments, that kind of led me back to square one. So let's get back to why are you here? Perhaps you're figuring out what role you play. Is it a loving caregiver? Is it a friend? A clinician or a therapist or a teacher who's going to be our cheerleader for AP Heroes? I believe it's because you are survivors of these difficult life moments where loved ones depend on you. And you may break, and you may want to give up. I sure do. Where you have a diagnosis no one has ever heard of, and you make up ways to explain it because you're so tired of explaining what chromosome AP is. Where you have a child you have to protect and defend, and wonder, can they be on their own? Will they ever not need your protection? How do you get through these fearful thoughts? But look around. Look at what we are doing here. We are the 8P Warrior Tribe. And these are our 8P heroes. After 1,200 hours of therapy over 6 years, one of our 8P heroes, Karina, took her first independent steps and began walking. Where the impossible now seems possible. We are creating her destiny together. All of you are helping me do that. It is in this fight and everything we learn from it. This is our legacy, and we're just kicking it off. It's how I think about why we're launching Project 8P. I often think of caterpillars I have up on the slide, and I think about their struggle. They struggle to fight to get out of their cocoon. They learn through that fight. They learn through the process of that struggle. And it helps them gain wings. It helps them grow. And it's the struggle that makes them strong enough to soar. And that's kind of how I think about what we're going through. We learn most from the extraordinary. And I always think about this quote: you beat a diagnosis by how you live, why you live, and the manner in which you live. And I truly believe that. I want you guys to think about that a little bit and take that home with you. I know it's not easy. So over the next 2 days, you are going to hear a lot of information from your new friends. We are the detectives. Write down your ideas and all of your doubts. Write down the most impossible, crazy questions that seem absurd. All of them turn into some sort of thought-provoking question, I promise you, and they're going to help us inform the research methodologies. Share them with me, share them with the researchers. What good is it if we don't collaborate and help? Research needs data, needs information, our knowledge. We need it to analyze it, identify those patterns I mentioned. We needed to understand which genes has the biggest neurological impact. There are clues. There are clues as an example in existing drugs that can be repurposed. You'll hear about those kind of approaches. There are things that can be used in creative ways to help boost immunity, improve motor function, help cognition. Even though we are years away, gene therapy is on to some groundbreaking advancements. And you'll hear a little bit more about that today too. We hold a lot of these clues here today. Some clues on chromosome 8 you may have heard are even linked to major common diseases. Every week there's some news story about scientists who missed a piece of their puzzle until they spoke with the patients. The pharmaceutical and biotech companies wasted billions of dollars until they spoke with the patients. This is the power of us being here together, that we will inform the researchers. We are going to work on this actively and solve this as partners to the researchers. So please, when you meet the clinicians and therapists and teachers and researchers today, let them know that you're here to be their partner. They want to hear from you just as much as you want to hear from them. So today I leave with you a little story that I always enjoy, and some of you may have heard it. It's about a woman who walks along a beach during low tide, and she is throwing live clams back into the ocean. She's strolling the beach, she's throwing clams back in before they die. Someone says to her, "Why are you doing that? There must be thousands of clams on this beach, and you can't save them all. How can you ever hope to make a difference?" She picks up one clam and she throws it back into the ocean and says, "I made a world of a difference to that one." And We all are doing that. Every little step that you guys are taking, whatever you can take out of your busy lives, you're making a world of a difference. Remember, this is our Project 8P. I'm no supermom. I don't like clams. I cook sometimes, but mostly we order a lot of takeout dinners. I don't spend as much time playing ball with my adorable son as I'd like. And just ask my husband if he ever gets any attention from me. We all make sacrifices to keep our commitment to each other. The doctors here work hard balancing personal lives and those embedded with their patients. But I think if Karina can do 45 hours of therapy every week with all of these challenges without complaining, I certainly can do it. So let's take a moment to thank each other. I sure need that. Husband to wife, wife to partner, children to parents and grandparents here today, family to friends, doctors to patients, and the passionate families to the researchers. Last night I learned many of your amazing backgrounds, super moms and super dads, professionals from law, technology, engineers, business people, academics, professors, teachers in education, and scientists, just to name a few. Thank you all. We are doing something that's far beyond us, far greater than we could ever achieve alone. So remember those doctors that didn't or couldn't help years ago? I'd like to introduce the first of them that did help. Her name is Dr. Wendy Chung. Sure. A geneticist who has discovered over 38 and more new genes, counting, who probably never sleeps, now with a broken arm, like most of us parents here, and works passionately to help us. For what is a very, very complex AP disorder that we all know, with so many genes involved, Dr. Chung was the first to agree to dig deeper.
Very good. I am so honored to be here today and thrilled to be able to get to know all of you at the meeting. As Bina said, I'm a geneticist here at Columbia. So I'm a pediatrician who takes care of children and adults, but who have special needs due to their genetic conditions. And I'm going to try and present to you some information, just some basics. Bina was kind enough to share with me some of your questions. So I'm going to try and address some of your questions, and then my colleague, Dr. Betsy Ross, this afternoon is going to address some of the other questions. And I'm going to share back with you the information that you all have been sharing with us, so putting it together for the community so you can see it back. As Bina said, all of this is being recorded, so if there are other people, other doctors, other therapists, teachers, anyone else you want to present it to, you'll be able to present it. Bina has a copy of all of the slides, so you don't have to furiously take notes about any of this. All of this is available. And I will be glad, hopefully I'll finish before the end of my hour so I can take some questions, and then as we break out in sessions this afternoon or at breakout sessions or during lunch, I'm glad for you to come up and ask me any questions that you might have. Okay, so as we're doing this, I wanted to start out with just a little bit of Genetics 101. I apologize, I know some of you know this in great detail, but I do know from some of the questions there are some people that have some questions. And one of the points that I want to make is that the room is full of some heterogeneity, meaning that although we're all united by something on 8P, not everyone has the same 8P change. And so we're a little bit apples and, or not apples, let me say tangerines and grapefruits and oranges. We're all citrus, but we're some different type of citrus, okay? And so as you're, looking around the room or getting to know each other, I do want you to be careful in terms of trying to anticipate what the future holds. We have to be a little bit more specific about the different 8P conditions to know whether or not what you're seeing with someone you're sitting with at lunch is really necessarily going to be applicable to your child and your family. So just keep that in the back of your minds as you're willing to share with each other exactly what your 8P difference is. We can come down to greater specificity or share more specific details, and at some point you guys may even want to sort of break out and cluster together in terms of being able to compare tangerines to tangerines and grapefruits to grapefruits, okay? So with this, I think many of you know we have, in terms of our genetic information, our genetic instructions and blueprint, they're housed in these structures that we call chromosomes. So most of us have 46 of these chromosomes. They're in our cells in our body, and it's like an encyclopedia or a volume, series of volumes of genetic information. And as I said, they come in a total of 46 or 23 pairs. And let me see if I can show you very well. So on chromosome 8 is the chromosome that unites all of us. In terms of P, you might say, well, what is that P all about? That stands for petite. And so you may be able to see that for each of the chromosomes, there's what we call a long arm and a short arm. And so the one that is physically shorter or smaller or more petite is the P arm. And so what we're talking about for all of the families are differences that are on this top part of chromosome 8 here. So now things get a little bit more complicated, and this is not meant to represent exactly chromosome 8, but in general chromosomes that we see. So for some of you, you have a chromosome 8 condition in your family that's a deletion. And so I'm showing this here by this yellow part that's on the normal chromosome that's now, you see this chromosome 8 is shorter. It's missing this portion. It's a deletion of this. Remember, there are 2 chromosome 8s, so your children have, each of you have 2 chromosome 8s. One would be normal, but one would have this deletion, or a missing amount of genetic material in that case. There are other individuals where, again, the same yellow segment here is duplicated. So there's an extra version of it, an extra copy of it. So rather than having 2 copies somewhere within your encyclopedia, there's a total of 3 copies that we see. And for some individuals, it's even more complicated. I'll show you briefly. There's something called an inversion, or INV, if you ever looked at your genetic test reports. And that's having the information there, but flipped around. And so the total amount of information is there, but the way it's structured is flipped. Okay, so now what gets confusing for some of you is that some of you are very special, some of your children are very special in that they have not just a deletion, not just a duplication, not just an inversion, but all 3 of those combined, right? And so that's what gets a little bit more confusing. So let me just be very clear, because I'm going to present data to you today that breaks it down into these 3 broad categories of some groups with deletions, some groups with duplications, and then, wait for it, up, some of you that have a combination of the 2. So for those of you that have the combination of the 2, if you ever looked at your genetic test report, it literally says this: inversion, duplication, deletion of 8P, right? So what that means, and I'm showing this as the normal chromosome 8 here. So for those of you who have children like this, they have 1 normal chromosome 8. And this region here in blue is duplicated, so that's why it's called the duplication. One of the copies is inverted, it's flipped around, and then for this region here at the tip, this red portion here, it's deleted, right? So it's actually complicated in that it's a deletion, this is missing, it's a duplication, there's an extra copy of this, and there's an inversion, it's flipped around. Now within this, within each of these regions, it's not just 1 gene within those regions, but depending on exactly what your configuration is, it could be several, to it could be even hundreds of genes within those regions. And one of the things and one of the questions that Bina has been thinking about and urging us to think about is that all of those genes are probably not created equal. Those genes do different things at different times in your life and different parts in your body. And some of them are probably more critical that you have 2 copies of, exactly 2 copies of. Probably some of them don't really care if there are 2 copies. 1 copy might be fine, 3 copies might be fine. But in terms of thinking about treatments for the future, one of the first fundamental questions is figuring out and inventorying which of those genes are important and what are they important for. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for just a question because this was meant to be the sort of overall primer in genetics, and I want to make sure everyone's up with me at this point, because if not, I want to make sure, because the next part will be complicated if we don't get this part straight. So any questions so far? Okay. For any of you that have questions, we're glad to go over your specific genetic test reports. Many of you have been kind enough to send those to us because we've been very carefully cataloging them. Some of you may have had what we call a chromosome analysis or a karyotype before we were able to get very, very detailed analysis to know exactly what genes were involved. So some of you have sent us saliva samples, and for many of you, we have now sent you back test reports, which you should feel free to share with your doctors, that now tell you at very precise resolution exactly which regions and what genes and what sort of addresses are deleted or duplicated. So for some of you, that is actually sort of more higher resolution or more detailed information than what your doctors had before. So if you have a child who is a teenager, they might have been diagnosed just by someone looking under the microscope at chromosome 8 and seeing something like this, and they said chromosome 8 looks different. And then the additional analyses that we have done is by being able to what we call map or give you the exact address of what is either deleted or duplicated. Does that make sense for people? If there's anyone who hasn't done that but wants to have that type of analysis done, you can certainly let us know. We're glad to take some samples while you're here at the meeting to be able to get you that kind of increased resolution. We'll have someone here tomorrow able to draw blood on the kiddos if there's anyone who wanted to have that type of sample done. Or I know of one person where we tried with a saliva sample and it didn't work, and we'll get it with a blood sample now. Okay? Very good. So let me move right along. So as we were doing this, and some of you know because we talked about this by WebEx a few months ago, now what we've been trying to do is take the grapefruit, the tangerines, the oranges, and be able to put them into these different groups. And now think about, based on your experience, what has life been like for you, for your child, and be able to understand, because as a community, we're all working together, right? We're trying to share experiences and learn for what's worked for you. Is it going to be applicable to another family? And to a certain extent, it's coming up with what I'm going to call best practices. So one of the things that I hope you'll get out of today, and that we can even more formally do, is for you to be able to take back to your doctors in whatever country you're in, and to be able, and you can blame it on me. You can say that Dr. Chung at Columbia in New York City, you can blame it on me. You can say she told us that these were the things to watch for and to be careful about, because we learned from 60 plus other families around the world in terms of putting all of our data together, and these are the things that she wants you to be careful about. And if any of your doctors want to email me or contact me personally, feel free. You'll be able to, we'll send around my email address, or you can Google me and find it right away online. But what we're trying to do is learn together and come up with best practices. I will warn you, and you'll see it in a second, that as we've done this, and you can see it from around the room, most of our individuals tend to be children. And so one of the things I'm always thinking about is, what is the future going to hold for us? And for me, future thinks about not only teenage years, but young adults and adult years after that. And to what extent can we do things right now that are going to prepare our people, our young people, for a healthy lives in the future? So that's the mindset in terms of as we've been thinking about that. So thank you so much for being generous. I will warn you that you're not done. So for those of you that have given us information, we value everything you've given us in terms of talking to us, doing things by sending us records, but you're not done because your child's lives are not done, right? So the goal on this is we'd like to continue following them as they get older, year by year, because some things will change. There are different challenges for adolescents, there are different challenges for young adults, and we as a community need to continue learning about that. So we've been trying to learn about what we've heard from you is important. So what we've heard from you is important are things like health, education, therapies, and cognitive function, being able to communicate and being able to just have a good life and what matters for that. As I said, we've been trying to divide this out by the different chromosome 8 differences, and as Dr. Ross is going to be talking about this afternoon, by comparing individuals that are apple, or rather tangerines and oranges, we may be able to better define what are the important genes that are in those regions. So for instance, if everyone that has the same gene that's deleted has the same challenges, maybe because it's a common gene that all those individuals have deleted, and maybe that'll point to us in terms of doing future studies focused on that one gene that everyone shares. So it's a matter of being able to genetically characterize everyone using the same metrics, the same way of doing that address, and also being able to compare symptoms and challenges. And all of this is in the goal of being able to make our families' lives better. So, as we're doing this, again, what we did is we reviewed your genetic information. When we didn't have that genetic information, we generated it ourselves. We've reviewed the medical records as well as what we call the medical history interview. And here, somewhere in the back of the room, we've got several members of my team who have and will continue working on that. And then one of the special things that Dr. Ross is a neurologist, a really fantastic neurologist, and one of the things that she specifically is focusing on are brain issues, and so thinking about the MRI and the brain waves, or the EEGs, and we'll be talking about seizures later today. We're trying to go very deeply on that because that's a challenge for some families. So, this is how this all shakes out. And just so you know, the 8P community is very similar to many other communities. My take-home message from this is I think we've done a great job in getting started. There's a little bit farther we can go, and so I'm going to challenge those of you who are here to help us rally the troops in terms of some of the folks who haven't been here in the following way. So we knew about, initially, almost 180 individuals out there who were in the community. Folks heard about this from BINA, from the Facebook group, from the WebEx that we did in terms of this. And a lot of people said, this is a good idea. We want to be able to contribute to this. And so 144 of them said, sign me up. When it came down to actually signing on the dotted line, actually giving a signature, we had a little bit of drop-off, and I think that's because people get busy or people forget or they decide they don't want to participate, and that's okay. That's an individual decision. And then of those 112 people who said it's okay to do, so far we've gotten 83 of them to do this medical history interview. So for any of you who are at any of these stages but not yet to this stage, we're happy to help you in terms of contributing, but we don't want you to feel pressured to do anything that you don't feel comfortable doing, okay? So what I'm going to be talking about today, therefore, are those individuals who made it to the point of doing the medical history interview. So now I'm going to try and orient you to the way to look at these. And I've broken these out, as I said, in the 3 groups, and you will individually need to think about what part of this applies to me, right? So for each of you, it's only a third of these graphs that apply to you. On the left, and it's set up the same way for all of the slides, are those of you who have kiddos with the inversion, duplication, deletion, right? So hopefully you all know who you are. There's some individuals who have only the deletion, and then there's some individuals who have only the duplication, right? So you can ignore the part of the slide that doesn't apply to you. You just focus in on the portion that does apply to you. I will warn you that even within the groups of the deletion and the duplication, not everyone has the same exact street address. And so there is still some heterogeneity even within these groups. And so for those of you who want to drill down into that detail, we can do it later, but for the sake of simplicity, I've done lumping rather than splitting. Okay, is everyone okay with this so far? Okay, is there anyone, go ahead.
Yeah, my son has deletion and the duplication, so we're in both.
So there's a group that have the deletion and the duplication.
But he's not in.
I'm sorry, he's not?
No inversion. No inversion.
No inversion. Okay.
So he's in both right columns.
Okay, so with that, he may have been left out of this analysis for the sake of the lumping within this, but for you should focus mostly on this column. He is going to be closest to this column here, or this part of the graph. Okay? And there maybe there are very few people who also have something beyond chromosome 8 that may have another chromosome. Those of you may know who you are. So there are a few people who are even a little bit more complicated than just 8p. Okay, so let me just describe to you in terms of now looking at this. These are the age of the individuals that we looked at. So individuals, again, tended to be young, on average age 6, on average age 12, or on average 18 for the 3 different groups. And so for the group here on the left in particular, you'll notice they're still on the young end. And so in terms of being able to project what's going to be happening when they're getting to be young adults, we have some limits in terms of how much we can know. And just so that you know how to read the graphs, this line in the middle is the average. So those are the numbers I was quoting you. And then this is the range in terms of the total range of individuals that we have. So we have some individuals who are not even a year of age and some individuals that are almost 22 years of age. So you can see that there is a range of individuals in each case, but in no case do we have anyone who's over, for instance, the age of 35 represented in any of these data. So long term in terms of being able to see what's going to happen, we're still somewhat limited.
I understand now. You've got 3 dots as your outliers.
Those are the outliers, exactly. Question, ma'am? We've got it, okay. Everyone okay so far? So that's the orientation in terms of how to look at these data I'm going to show you about. So just as an example, and you're over the newborn period, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about this. Again, set up in the same way. We've got the inversion del dupes, or dupe dels, the deletions and the duplications. Many of you, as moms especially, knew that something was different relatively early on. You were noticing things like your baby was a little bit lower in tone, maybe a little bit floppier, maybe a little bit more difficulty in terms of feeding. Some of the children have been in the hospital for a period of time, either with issues with low blood sugar, some breathing problems. Again, varied a little bit, but these were some things that we commonly saw within the group. One of the things I think Bina noticed last night, which is absolutely true, is that many of our children are petite, not just because of the 8p part of things, but they are shorter. They are more petite. They're a little bit different in terms of growing. One of the things I would love to see that comes out of this is that when you go to your pediatrician, they probably plot your child on a growth curve, and you notice that they're on the lower end of the growth curve, or maybe even off the growth curve. Really, one of the things we need to have is a growth curve that's specifically for 8p, so that you can know how your kids are measuring up in terms of other kids. That's a long-term goal that I have for us as a community. I will tell you that one of the things I always say to families, and again, you can take this back to your doctors, is that we want optimally, your children in terms of their height is to a certain extent programmed by their chromosome 8p. So that's kind of, from a height point of view, that's sort of hard set. In terms of their nutrition, what we want them to do is we want them to get enough calories, enough good nutrition that they're strong, and working with their therapist for that. So what your pediatricians can easily do is look at their weight for their height. And one of the things we want to do is we don't want the children to be too skinny, and we don't want them to be too thick, right? And so there's an optimal in between, and your pediatricians have normal growth charts that are made for all children that can do that ratio of the weight to the height. So even before we get to the point of having an 8p specific growth curve, one of the things your doctor should be doing is making sure nutrition is optimized so that we have the right weight for the height. But one of the things, again, that you'll notice, and these are in something called Z-scores. So let me try and explain the concept of that. So in this particular case, height depends on how old you are, right? If you're 3 years old, a normal height is different than if you're 13 years old. So what we do is we take a standard deviation in the normal population, and we're normalizing everyone to what they should be in terms of their height for the age. And so this is compared to normal individuals. If you were exactly average for your child's age, your Z-score would be 0. Because you would be at the average. You would not have deviated up or down from what we see in the average population. On the other hand, if you're 1 standard deviation above the general population, or about 30% taller, and the group that's about 30% taller, then you'll be a Z-score of +1. If you're in the group of the population that's about 30% of the population that's lower than the average height, then you'll be a Z-score of -1. So minus means you're shorter, plus means you're taller, okay? So we're looking for heights again, and we're dividing by the 3 groups that we talked about before. And so you'll see on average, again, look at these red bars in terms of being able to see this, and I apologize, this one got shifted a little. But when we look at this, our children with the inversion, duplication, deletions are on average about 1.4 standard deviations below the mean. So on average, that translates into many of them are at the bottom part of that growth curve. Some of them are still on that growth curve in your regular pediatrician's office, but they're at the lower portion of that. What we like to see is, though, that they're continuing to follow the growth curve, so they're continuing to grow, they're not stagnating, they're not stopping in terms of that, but they're growing kind of parallel to the lower part of the growth curve. In the same way, and again, there's a range, so it's not that everyone is necessarily exactly that. We do have some people who are much shorter, some people that are even average height. Again, 0 would be an average height, and some people even a little bit above average, but most people tend to be a little bit shorter. And so with that, and you can see the same things, as I said, for some of the other groups. For the deletion groups alone, they tend not to have as much of a challenge, and we just don't have much data for the duplication groups. So one of the things that you will see, and just to orient you, I've put in the sample size, or how many numbers we have. So when it comes to numbers, and this was growth based on today's growth or most recent growth, we had 15 individuals here, we had only 3 individuals here, and only 1 individual here. So one of the challenges with this is it's based on very sparse data, right? And so one of the things that we did is outside in the back, we have brought tape measures. And so for any of you guys who want to be able to have your, and there's a scale too. So for anyone who wants to check in today, have your child's height measured to the extent that they can stand up, or you can tell us if you know from your pediatrician, measuring their head circumference or their head size, or measuring their weight. We've got all of those right outside with the team here so that we can bring these numbers up. We can fill these numbers in and be able to generate these growth curves that we need to tell this. So the reason I mention this is that some people get worried about the growth, and they ask me things like, so Dr. Wendy, should we be using growth hormone? Should we be using injections, or should we be doing something that will make our children grow much more? And in general, what I say is their body, as long as it's healthy, I think it's fine. This is what I expect it to be, and they're not necessarily going to grow that much more unless they're growth hormone deficient. And at least in my experience in talking with many of the families, your children are not growth hormone deficient. They're not missing the hormone or the signal to grow. Their bodies are just programmed to grow and to be a little bit smaller. So I don't want you to get worried about that. Everything's fine. The main thing is to make sure they're healthy. Okay, so that's what we see in terms of growth. And again, I think I just went over that. So the next portion we were thinking about, and we asked for your information about, was about development. So different milestones, and those of you for younger children, I think many of you were more interested in terms of the future. For those of you with older children, you have more experience with this. But this is now looking at the age at which individuals were sitting. And again, for the milestones, I'm going to point this out in the same way. So this is measured in months. So for individuals with the inversion, duplication, deletion, it was on average about 1.5 years by the time individuals were sitting on their own by themselves without assistance. And again, this is based on looking at 18 individuals. For individuals with the deletion, they were doing this a little bit earlier, so they were on average about 8 months of age when they started sitting. One of the things I will say is that developmentally, and again, you guys, I'm learning from you, but from what I've understood so far, everyone is continuing to make forward progress. This is in general not a degenerative condition where folks are losing the ability over time. And we may get into some specific situations where maybe that's not exactly true, but for the most part, that's what we've seen. So as Bina was saying, and this is true of Karina, and it is true of other kiddos as well, they are later in walking, but many of the children have been able to walk. I will also point out that I've put this on the bottom of the slides, not everyone at their current age is walking. So what I've shown you in terms of the graphs are for those individuals who have been able to walk, the age at which they have on average been able to attain that. So again, for the inversion, duplication, deletions, for those who have been able to attain it, this is now in years, in terms of doing this. They've been about 2.5, but there's been quite a range, right? So one of the points is that if you have younger children who are making progress in terms of doing that, even if they're 2.5, even if they're 3, don't give up, right? Continue trying in terms of doing it. It takes effort. It takes, as Bina was saying, hours and hours of those warriors pushing on in terms of doing this, but it may still happen. It may be a little bit later. I also want to say, though, that it may not happen. There are some individuals who have gotten their, and again, the size of the deletions or duplications based on other issues, it may have just been really challenging, and that just may not be something that's going to be an easy milestone for them to reach. Not that there aren't many other wonderful things that they are learning and knowing and doing, but walking may be a particular challenge. Okay, so we also were thinking about communication, so talking, very specifically talking with words coming out of the mouth. That's not the only way that it can happen, but as we did this again for first words, individuals with the inversion, duplication, deletion, about 2 years for the first words, and then individuals with the deletion a little bit older in terms of when that started happening. But again, there are many individuals that, at least in terms of spoken words, the words aren't coming out yet. I don't know exactly when they will or how they will, but they're not coming out yet. Now, one of the things we did survey in this, because this is sort of a more advanced way of doing this, this doesn't mean your kiddos are not understanding, right? So there's a different part of language, which is about understanding, listening, comprehending, understanding this. And so many of the kiddos are understanding and processing. So be careful what you say. They're listening. And increasingly, there are other ways of communicating besides getting the words out. And so many of you have started using other alternative modes of communication, and we can talk about this in the breakout session, but there are other ways beyond just literally getting the words out, communication devices, signing, even just by the expression on your children's face. Many of us know what's going on. So with that, to realize that, as I said, many of them are full of things to let us know about, but it may not be coming out as words yet. Okay, so then we started thinking about specific neurological issues, either diagnoses or seizures, but things related to the brain, something that Dr. Ross is going to be talking about. And I want to reorient you. Everyone's color-coded in this case, so it's the duplication starting first in blue, in yellow, the inversion, duplication, deletions, and then in red, the deletions. So you can see, and I do think some of these vary around the world in an interesting way in terms of who gets what diagnoses. In the United States, I think more individuals get diagnosed with autism than in other parts of the world. So just keep that in mind as well as you're reaching out and talking with other families. Across 8P, there are a fair number of individuals who have the diagnosis of autism. In the United States in particular, and I think many of you know this, that diagnosis is often very helpful from an educational point of view in terms of getting ABA services or special education services. So this is, to me, fairly common to see anywhere from 20 to 40% of individuals in our community with an autism diagnosis. I would say fairly consistently we see problems with muscle tone, so physically either being loose and lax or being tight. Sometimes in the same person, different muscles can be loose and different muscles can be tight. And for certain people over the life course, things can change. So they can become tight at one time and looser in another time. I will say it's really important, even for those of you who have older children, the tightness can become an issue, or the hypertonia, too much tone, being too tight, can become an issue because it can lead to things like contractures, differences in mobility, and orthopedic issues, which can be uncomfortable. And so I encourage you to work with your neurologist, your physical therapist, in terms of the exercises and the physical therapy that keeps things loose enough that hopefully we can avoid surgery or tendon releases or scoliosis or things that can be challenging later on. But this is a fairly consistent thing that we see across all of the groups. We're going to have a special session on this today. But seizures are especially, for 2 of the 3 groups, about half of the children at some point have had seizures, and we're going to talk a lot more about this. One of the things is that many of you, your children have been on medications that have done a good job of controlling the seizures, so that's really good. I will say that it's important to make sure that if your child is in one of the groups that has not been diagnosed with seizures, make sure that they have been evaluated for seizures, because some people don't realize that a certain thing that's happening is really a seizure. Seizures can look like all sorts of different things, and I'm not going to spend time now because we're going to hear about it later, but if your child has not had an EEG, an electroencephalogram, important to know that they've been looked at, they've been evaluated, and there are no seizures present, because there are good treatments for that. And then finally, our children have issues in terms of delays, and there are lots of things that we do to help them with that. Okay, so again, we're going to talk more about this later, but there are different types of seizures. There's some that look like staring episodes. We call those absence seizures. There's some that look like jerking movements or tonic-clonic seizures. Those ones are the ones you sort of are harder to miss, but the absence seizures, staring out, can be harder, can be easier to miss. And then there are some that are associated specifically with an illness, with fever. The febrile seizures worry us a little bit less, but those other types of seizures we definitely want to treat and make sure we have under control. So again, we're going to talk about this more later. One other pearl I will say is, even if your child is known to have seizures and on medications, but suddenly they were under control and they start again, if you're worried about it, time to go back to your neurologist. And adolescence or puberty is a time to be especially mindful of this, because at the time that hormones are changing, that the body is changing, that can have an effect in terms of the brain changing as well. And so especially to be tuned in at that time, even if the seizures have been well controlled or even didn't need medication for a time, if you're seeing something during that time period, good to check in again with your neurologist. Okay, we've also learned that in terms of imaging or looking at the actual structure of the brain, that we can see some differences in terms of the way the brain developed. And one of the things is that your brain has 2 halves, and it has a bridge that connects the 2 halves of the brain. It's called the corpus callosum. And so for many individuals, and again, I've color-coded these, but for many individuals, either that bridge was like, instead of being an 8-lane highway, it's like a 2-lane road. So there's not as much of a connection that's going back and forth. And that poses some challenges in terms of coordination between the 2 sides of the brain. Coordinating thoughts, coordinating actions becomes more challenging. There are even some individuals where there is no connection. There's no bridge that's going back and forth, and so the 2 sides of the brain are both working, but they're not necessarily coordinating as effectively as it might be for other people. So that's part of the challenge in terms of why we see some of the things we do. As Dr. Ross is going to talk about later, we don't have a way of going back now and building that bridge. So that was something from a developmental point of view. The brain has developed. We can't go in and sort of sew in a bridge at that point, but there are ways of being able, and this is what your special education teams are doing, to be able to make sure the right part of the brain's working, the left part of the brain is working, and they do their thing, and we get those to be optimized. But this is one of the reasons why we see some of the challenges that we do. We're also going to hear a session later about heart issues. Not everyone has heart issues, but I will say, to me, and I study a lot of genetic conditions, it's a significant fraction of individuals who have heart issues, about half on average. Some of them are structural, so that another way of saying that is it's congenital heart disease. It's something different in terms of the way the heart developed. For many of your children, they've had surgery, they've had something in terms of a catheterization to fix this, or some other issue. And if that has been fixed, hopefully the plumbing issues, so to speak, have been fixed and are done. But one of the issues that we know from working on congenital heart disease is when children get to be adults, sometimes there can be other things that happen in terms of rhythm. So how frequently, how regularly the heart beats, as well as how strong it is, how well it squeezes. And so there is need to continue following with your cardiologist, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Shannon Neese about that later today. But there's a wide range those different types, and so I urge you, if you have questions that have gone beyond your cardiologist, we need to tailor those answers to your questions about how serious those problems are based on the plumbing of your child's heart. If it was something simple like an atrial septal defect or a ventricular septal defect, those things tend to be much simpler than some of your children have more complex types of congenital heart disease, but it is frequent. If, for some reason, your child never had an echocardiogram, so never had a way to look at the heart visually, where they use sound waves to look at the heart, I don't think there are many of you, but I know there could be some of you, it is time to have an echocardiogram. Time to have someone look at the heart, make sure there's nothing that's a problem there, make sure there's nothing on the EKG, but just check and make sure everything's okay, because there can be some significant problems that are easy to fix as long as you know that they need to be fixed and need to be addressed. Okay. Another thing many of you said was common are issues with the belly. And this is something that we see. There is actually a brain in the belly. So in the same way that there's a brain in your head, there are neurons, there are brain cells, nerve cells that are also in the intestine that determine how your intestines contract and move things along. And so one thing that was fairly common amongst that you reported was what we call constipation. And I think everyone knows what that is, but things aren't moving along so well. And that's because in the same way that the muscle tone is low in the muscles here and the muscles in the arm, the muscles in the intestine are also low. So things aren't contracting as well. Things aren't moving along as well, and they're getting stuck. Other folks had problems in terms of what we call gastrointestinal reflux or heartburn. And in the same way, there are valves in the stomach that keep things from the acid from going back up from your stomach up into your throat. And in that same way, the tone is not so good, things aren't so tight, it's a little bit looser. And so things can go back up as well. And so for many of you, your children are on medication that helps that, so it's not so uncomfortable. But if that is a possibility, if your child is very cranky, irritable, there's something going on, these may be some of the reasons. It's just they've got tummy troubles and they're not feeling so comfortable. And then some of the children are on gastric tubes in terms of helping with feeding. They may have some more problems in terms of actually feeding and swallowing. So when we have these challenges, brain, one of the things is that it's important to make sure the senses are working as well as possible, because we want the brain to be able to absorb information clearly. And so when I think about that, I want the senses, in particular the eyes and the ears, to be working as well as they can be, because I don't want your kiddos to be missing out on the world around them. So one of the things we know from hearing from you is that vision is a challenge, again, for about a little over half of the individuals. It a variety of things. Some are in the eyes themselves, so structurally in the eyes. What I mean by refractive disorders, or what I have, we need glasses. We have trouble oftentimes seeing at distances that are greater. Some folks have problems in terms of a lazy eye, or what we call strabismus, and that's something that can be surgically repaired, and some of you have had surgical repair for that. And then some of you, the issue is not really in the eye, it's in the brain. In the back of the brain over here, that's the signals from the eye and processing it in the visual cortex. And that problem is not going to be corrected with glasses. That's a problem with the way that part of the brain is working. It's a less frequent problem, but as your ophthalmologists are fixing everything they can with the eyes and your child is not reacting, then we oftentimes realize that it's a problem with the processing center in the back of the brain. My take-home message in this, though, is that, again, if any of you have not had your child see an ophthalmologist or an eye doctor, at least it's good to get that examination once to make sure that everything is okay. It can be sometimes challenging to know exactly how they're seeing if they can't read the letter chart for you, which is something that our kiddos can't necessarily do. So it's important, if it's at all possible, to see a pediatric ophthalmologist who's really specialized in children that have special needs, because they're able to tell in terms of the vision how well they're seeing. So that gives us then highways coming into the brain to process the world in that way. As we know, because of the tone being muscle, or the muscle tone being low, sometimes we see orthopedic issues or musculoskeletal issues. And this is oftentimes when our orthopedic surgeons help us with this. This is something that can be age dependent. And so one of the things we've seen, particularly as the children are getting older, is scoliosis or curvature of the spine. Oftentimes, adolescence is an age of that you want to be real careful of this, because kiddos are growing a lot, and as they're growing, their spine may not stay straight. If they're having trouble with either low or high tone, they may start having curvature, and so it's important in terms of start with a pediatrician to screen for that, and then if necessary, even having an orthopedic surgeon do some x-rays and see exactly how much the curvature is. If we get this early, oftentimes we can avoid surgery, and let me tell you, surgery can be a big deal for our kiddos, so we'd like to avoid surgery whenever we can. But if the scoliosis gets too severe, there can be breathing problems ultimately. So it's something that we need to address if it's something that's there. There can be some things that we also see in terms of some of the low muscle tone can cause problems with the joints being unstable. So many of you are also have braces or having orthotics that your children are wearing. That helps with their stability as they're starting to take their steps, and it also can help in terms of some of the joint stability as well. With that, I know some of the kids I've seen that have also some foot issues, and so in terms of sometimes special shoes, if your kids are ambulating, your feet may be sort of twisting out a little bit. They may, again, need some supports or special shoes, but the orthopedist can oftentimes help us with those issues. There are some children who've had problems with the kidneys or sometimes genital issues. These can either be seen ultrasound. So again, many of you had ultrasounds of the heart. Many of you also, I think it's a good idea to look at the kidneys by ultrasound. Again, it just has to be done one time in your child's life. If they had it when they were itty bitty and it was fine then, it's not like you're going to suddenly find that they're missing a kidney when they're 13. So as long as it was fine then, it's the same now. But if it wasn't done, it's important to know whether or not there are any issues, because again, there are issues that can be addressed, and sometimes they can make infections or urinary tract infections much more serious. So important to know whether that's an issue. Infections in general, I would say, and if you think about if you have other children, all kids get infections almost. All of us get infections at some point. Ear infections, colds, pneumonia sometimes, urinary tract infections. So in general, I find that this frequency is about what we see in the general population. What I think is that it's harder on our kiddos, right? It's bigger toll on them. It takes them more time to recuperate from this, and oftentimes I think we catch the infections a little bit later sometimes because we don't always know. They can't always tell us exactly what's going on, and so I know you guys have figured this out, but don't hesitate. You know your children and advocate for them. If you know they're off their game, make sure their pediatrician is doing a good job of checking for common infections like ear infections and urinary tract infections. Okay, but I don't think they have immunodeficiency. So to be very clear, I don't think they need to be in bubbles or anything like that. Purell, a good idea though. So, okay. So with all of this, why in the world did we go through all of this? Like I said, what we want to do is be able to empower you to advocate for your children. So in the short term, what we're doing is this in a sort of unofficial way, what we're doing today, giving you this information. In the longer term, what we'd like to do is be able to publish this. And I will say this is a little bit of arrogance on the side of doctors, but it's all with good reason. They believe this more if it's published in a journal that's been what they call peer-reviewed. So in other words, if they've had lots of other smart people look at it and poke holes at it and say, but did you think of this and what do you think of that? So it's the process we have in science to make the science better. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, right? So the process that we're going to be doing with this is my goal is that I want to, by the end of the year, so I'm warning you, we're coming after you, by the end of the year that we will be able to submit this to a journal with all of the 8P conditions together, broken out the way we have today so that you can see the difference, but to be able to publish this so that any of your naysaying doctors that say, well, what does that Dr. Chung know? This will be a peer-reviewed in a journal, in a medical journal, where they can say, no, it's not just Dr. Chung's idea, it's a bunch of other really smart people in the community in general who have really made sure that we're doing the right thing, and this is what we now have to guide us in terms of this. It will help you in terms of insurance coverage for those of you who are in the United States, to be able to get insurance coverage for the types of things that I've talked about, to get special education plans, individual education plans that you need, therapies covered, all of those things. So it is self-serving. Again, I'm not trying to push anyone to do anything they're not comfortable doing, but I think this is something that's going to help all of us as we're doing this. I will tell you that there are many holes we have in the data. So in some cases, you've seen that our numbers are pretty thin right now. In terms of some of the groups, we need to lift those numbers up so that people are confident in that. We've got members of my team that are in the back of the room. I think Carolyn can wave her hand, so she'll be available during the break and as we're stepping out. And we know who you are. So if there are particular pieces of information you're missing, feel free to stop by and see Carolyn and just check in and say, I'm whoever you are. And Carolyn will say, oh, well, we're missing X, Y, and Z. Can you tell me that? And we'll fill it in right now, fill in those blanks. It's a lot more and you're busy and you've got other things you want to do here, because I admit I'd rather spend my time with other of you guys than with us. But anyway, if that's the case, we can also do it offline afterwards, right after you get home. But we do want to try and fill this up relatively soon, because it takes us about 3 months to get through the whole process of putting a manuscript together and really making sure it's good. So we'd like to have a data freeze if we can by the end of the summer. So that's our timeline for all of you guys out there. As we're doing this, Dr. is going to talk a lot more about the other issues, but I want to put out a shout out. There are several members of the group here, you know who you are, I won't out you, but we're incredibly generous to give skin biopsies. So we took little pieces of skin from certain of the individuals, and some of the folks that are going to be giving blood samples tomorrow, they have taken one for the team, for all of you guys out there, because we're going to be studying their cells and their representatives for other people here. So if you didn't donate, don't feel like, oh my gosh, but you didn't get me. We may be coming back to you at some point in the future, but we're going to be doing some very detailed studies. Dr. Ross will talk about this more later, but their contribution is incredibly important to be able to catalyze the science that we need to do this. So we thank all of you who were so incredibly generous for making that donation. Okay, so let me stop here and see if there are any quick questions. Yeah.
Curious, the
hypermobility was only at 6%. Now that is something that can often, even in average individuals, be overlooked if it's not tested, and the testing criteria has changed within the last couple of years. Do you feel that that potentially is underscored at 6%?
So again, just to go back in terms of how we found out what we did, this was not based on me looking at each one of your children and doing a very specific standardized assessment. Based on what you guys told us. We trust that parents know what they've been told at least, right? But whether or not the physician told you the correct thing or whether or not your physical therapist told you correctly, that's a different story.
Or they thoroughly evaluated it.
Right. So I think one of the things, and I think we need to put our heads together, that's what this conference is about. To me, it's identifying priorities. So listening to you and knowing what are the most important things for you, and then thinking about what are the best, most robust ways to answer the questions have. And if it's that we need to do standardized evaluations at the next family meeting, you may see that we have research stations set up and we have kiddos come through and do standardized evaluations if it's something you guys think is important.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Is this question for me? Is our color coding going to bring us into groups closer to our things?
Oh, you're asking me a question. Oh, I'm so sorry. Trying to decide where lunch should be served today.
Are they based on like duplication or?
So the majority of the colors are grouped by diagnosis, yes.
Okay.
The red group is most likely not inversion dupe del. It's a little bit of a mixed group, so deletion only, and trisomy 8p or mosaicism, and some that might, one or two here that have a translocation on another chromosome.
Okay.
In the back.
May I ask, how has the agenesis contributed to, I'm not sure if you go simultaneously, but how has agenesis affected the walking and the talking and just the general abilities? Do you find that the greater the agenesis, the more pronounced the difficulties?
Yep. So let me repeat your question and see if I got it right. So the question is around the agenesis of the corpus callosum, or the connection between the two sides of the brain, and is there any correlation between essentially a brain difference that we can see structurally and that what we see functionally in terms of the neurological status? I would say we haven't done that as a formal multi-regression analysis and put that in as one of the variables. It's complicated, and I don't know that we're, for those of you who are kind of geeks, I don't know that we're going to be powered to be able to do that because we have enough heterogeneity between the genetics to be able to look at one genetic group and look at the brain malformations. It's an incredibly important question, and that's part of what Dr. Ross is doing with looking at the brain MRIs to be able to quantify not just the ACC but also other brain differences. But as a question, I'm glad you asked the question because I think that's one of the things that we should do in the analyses. But
She has the full agenesis. I mean, she's doing very well in some areas. Verbally, she's doing very well, but walking has been difficult. But there's been some spontaneous progression, and then she'll plateau, and then there's a spontaneous jump of inability. So we didn't know how that might be related to the lack of skill.
yeah, I think that's part of the answer, but just as you're saying, even though she's got the agenesis of the corpus callosum, she's got lots of other good parts of her brain that are working.
You mentioned potential visual impairment. Was there any hearing impairment that you saw in this disease?
So what we saw is that we didn't see, in general, hearing impairment. We didn't see deafness as a general rule. What we could see, though, is that children that had had multiple ear infections oftentimes had sort of short-term fluid in the ears and had problems with that. So it wasn't a permanent hearing loss or what we call a sensory neural hearing loss. If others feel differently, let me know, but that's not what we were seeing. What it does suggest to me, though, is that if your child, and this would be probably more for the younger children where we're seeing more ear infections, for those of you who still have younger kiddos, if lots of ear infections are an issue, I recommend putting tubes in the ears more aggressively than you would for another child, just to make sure that they're not sort of hearing like they're underwater all the time, but not permanent hearing loss.
For my Spanish friends here, just on the slide. And if any other, have you had any other experiences of
What did she say?
Okay, so the question is, in terms of hernias.
Now I have the microphone. Everybody can hear me. Sorry. Did you hear me?
Yeah, I think so. So the question was in terms of hernias. So some of you know, at least I will out myself. I've had a hernia and had a hernia repair, and so that's when some of your intestines kind of bulges through the muscle in abdomen. That's a relatively different from what you talked about, congenital diaphragmatic hernia.
Okay.
I know a lot about that condition because we study that. We have seen CDH, or congenital diaphragmatic hernia with AP, but it is very rare. It is not a common thing that we see. And for those of you who say, what in the world is that? Your diaphragm.
That's me, by the way, because
okay,
that's-
your diaphragm is your breathing muscle. It separates your chest from your abdomen. It is not a subtle disorder. Doctors will recognize within usually the first day or two of life. So if you weren't diagnosed with a CDH or a diaphragmatic hernia, don't panic and say, oh my goodness, I've got to go home and see if my child has that. You wouldn't miss it. You would know about this if it were something clinically important.
Okay, so it's not.
So it's not,
Perfect.
congenital diaphragmatic hernia was not what I meant by that. I meant what we usually call an inguinal hernia
Yeah.
or an abdominal hernia, sort of a simple hernia.
Thanks.
Question?
Hi. I was wondering, is there an average age for onset of seizures? If they've had an EEG in like when they were first born and everything was clear, is that something that could pop up later on?
Yeah. So the children in general have been having seizures within the first 2 years of life, which is the most normal, the most common in terms of that. I'll have to go back and see what the oldest in terms of new onset seizures. I don't know right off the top of my head, but we'll get back to you as a community.
I realize you only had a few outliers that are above the age of 6. Do you find regression of speech occurs, as is often seen in autism, where a child gains speech, may have a sizable vocabulary, and then it diminishes to a few single words?
Yeah. So great question. trajectory in general for both speech and I would say development in general is that it's slow and steady in terms, and I think all of us know this. It takes longer before something is really solid. So sometimes it feels like regression because it's there one day and gone the next, but I would say that in part that's because it's not really solid yet, and that's when it becomes speech or other motor issues. There are things that are true regression. Now, what I get concerned about, and this is for those families who've had epilepsy, sometimes epilepsy can be a complicating factor to the regression. So for those of you who have had children with epilepsy, before the epilepsy gets well managed in terms of getting rid of the seizures and getting to a medication where your children aren't too sleepy, I definitely have seen with AP regression in terms of losing in a permanent way. It's not just not solidifying, but it's regression. I have not personally, but again, you guys are the experts, so you tell me, in the absence of seizures and having looked at seizures and realizing there weren't seizures, I haven't seen real true regression that's continued to go downhill.
I had one more question, and I realize that this didn't come up here, but years ago when I belonged to, there was half a dozen of us parents who had 8P inversion duplications mostly and deletions, and we would get on the phone and chat. And we all noted, several of us, that we either had a fully, and I'll explain this for the audience, a filamentous umbilical cord. A filamentous umbilical cord for the audience is incredibly rare in a medical textbook that's this thick on obstetrics. You'll get a paragraph this big, and it will tell you 99.9% of the children pass away. It's like a tree with the trunk on a hill where the roots are all exposed. So all it takes is for the baby to move, the cord will rupture, and the baby will pass away. So usually these infants don't get to term. To get to term with the cord is exceptionally rare, and then you would expect the child to pass away. So now mine was fully filamentous, but the other children, the obstetricians noted that there was partial. And has that been noted as a feature of the trisomy? Or has that been examined?
So it's a great point that you mentioned, and Caroline will help me remember to go back. So this was not actually part of our standard questionnaire to ask about, and you may have noticed this.
Yeah, no, it was not brought up. That's why I asked, because it's something people would not think about if it did not cause a problem.
So exactly what you said. We didn't ask. We didn't think about it. We didn't know about it. So we are going to go back now and ask. How's that?
That sounds excellent. Because then it becomes a question of whether that's familial.
Yeah.
Or something that's just de novo and sporadic or unique only to that birth and child.
It's a great observation, and let me just say for all of you out there, there are things that we didn't ask because we didn't know to ask. Please keep tapping us on the shoulder and pointing these things out, and as you talk amongst yourselves and realize it's not just you, but you and 5 other people, definitely, I don't care whether you give them to Bina, give them to me, Dr. Ross, I don't care, but let's collate this. I think this should be part of what comes out of this conference.
Thank you very much.
Stimuli, did you look at whether or not there was a regular sleep pattern to the children?
Okay, so...
Just as one that affects the parents quite a lot.
Okay, I'm going to do survey says here. No one has to answer. Okay, let me be clear. No one has to answer. But how many of you have noticed sleep irregularities in your children? Okay. Okay, hands down.
I mean, relative to the siblings as well.
Relative to your siblings, so not just because, right. Okay, so how many of you is that sleep irregularity a problem falling asleep? Okay. For how many is it because the child wakes up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep?
Yeah.
And for how many of you is it that your child will not sleep even for days, either 1 or 2 days, sort of continuously?
No, but you can keep them away.
Thankfully not.
Okay.
What I have learned with my daughter, because she's 24, is that if we don't have a problem with her, well, we don't have a problem with her not going to sleep, but we had to do a
when we had to do a sleep-deprived study, what we found was we were the ones falling asleep. But if you put television on, she would never fall asleep. It wouldn't matter how long. We probably could have kept her there literally for days. If you kept her in front of something like a computer or TV going, there would be no sleep. You couldn't get her to fall asleep.
Okay, so seeing your hands now, there is a specific instrument that we use, a questionnaire online, to be able to have parents report what the sleep issues are. One of the things that I'm just guessing that will come again out of this conference is that we should give you guys collectively that same questionnaire. It's a standardized thing so we can compare it to other individuals. If you guys decided, and I don't know, Bina, wherever Bina is, we may have to do this as a poll afterwards. We have very, very fancy ways of being able to assess sleep in individuals. Some of you may wear a Fitbit. There are ways that we do that. We have things we can put under a mattress to be able to see how children are sleeping at night. So it's your research agenda. If you guys say sleep is like the top item that we need to be able to get a handle on, we have ways of dealing with that. The point of the conference is we don't want to torture you with 201 things. We want to figure out what are the top 3 things on your research agenda. And I'm just conscious of time so I don't take away someone else's time. So you guys
This is regarding bifold uvula and like the partial cleft palate thing. How common is that, and does that impact speech a lot?
Yeah. So very good question. So the question is, you've got a little dumbbell in the back of your throat. When the doctor says, say ah, that's what we look at. And there are some people that instead of looking like a dumbbell, it looks like an upside down heart. So it didn't quite come together. The other thing we can see is that in terms of in the mouth, there can be a small opening, sometimes even one that we don't see, but that causes problems with speech because the air isn't going through the mouth and through the nose in the right way. So one of the signals we see is that that in general, individuals with chromosome 8 issues are more likely to have what we call midline defects. That's what the corpus callosum problem is. Essentially, it hasn't been things coming together at the midline. There are more problems with the midline in the way the mouth forms as well, or the upper part of the mouth, or the palate, as well as in the back of the throat. So I think in terms of, yes, we have seen it. We'll have to pull numbers. It's certainly not the majority of individuals. My personal sense is that the anatomy may be a little bit different, and that causes some of the problems with phonation and speech, but is probably not all because of either hard palate or soft palate clefts that could surgically be repaired. Do we have time for one
Hey guys,
more
I think we actually are just out of time, but Dr. Wendy, I think you're going to be here the rest of the day and in the breakout, so please, please, please get your questions in when you can.
Thank you so much.